On April 17, 1961, 1,400 Cuban exiles launched what became a botched invasion at the Bay of Pigs on the south coast of Cuba. In 1959, Fidel Castro came to power in an armed communist revolt that overthrew Cuban dictator Fulgencio Batista.
Fidel, our liberator, they roared. Fidel, our savior. It was January 1959.
The U.S. government distrusted Castro and was wary of his relationship with Nikita Khrushchev, the leader of the Soviet Union. Before his inauguration, John F. Kennedy was briefed on a plan by the CIA developed during the Eisenhower administration to train Cuban exiles for an invasion of their homeland. The plan anticipated that the Cuban people and elements of the Cuban military would support the invasion. The ultimate goal was the overthrow of Castro and the establishment of a non-communist government friendly to the United States. President Eisenhower approved the program in March 1960. The CIA set up training camps in Guatemala, and by November the operation had prepared and trained a small army for the invasion. Despite efforts of the U.S. government to keep the invasion plans covert, it became common knowledge among Cuban exiles in Miami. Through Cuban intelligence, Castro learned of the training camps in Guatemala as early as October 1960. Shortly after his inauguration, in February 1961, President Kennedy authorized the invasion. He determined to disguise U.S. support. The landing point at the Bay of Pigs was part of the deception. The site was a remote swampy area on the southern coast of Cuba, where a night landing might help to hide any U.S. involvement. The original invasion plan called for 2 airstrikes against Cuban air bases. A 1,400-man invasion force would then disembark under the cover of darkness and launch a surprise attack. Paratroopers would be dropped in advance of the invasion to disrupt and repel Cuban forces. Simultaneously, a smaller force would land on the east coast of Cuba to create confusion. The main force would advance across the island to Matanzas and set up a defensive position. The first mishap occurred on April 15, 1961, when 8 bombers left Nicaragua to bomb Cuban airfields. The CIA had used obsolete World War II B-26 bombers and painted them to look like Cuban Air Force planes. The bombers missed many of their targets and left most of Castro's air force intact. President Kennedy then canceled a second airstrike. On April 17, the Cuban exile invasion force, known as Brigade 2506, landed at beaches along the Bay of Pigs and immediately came under heavy fire. Cuban planes sank 2 escort ships and destroyed half of the exiles' air support. Bad weather also hampered the ground force. Over the next 24 hours, Castro ordered roughly 20,000 troops to advance towards the beach, and the Cuban Air Force continued to control the skies. As the situation grew increasingly grim, President Kennedy authorized 6 unmarked American fighter planes to help defend the invading force. But the planes arrived an hour late, most likely confused by the change in time zones between Nicaragua and Cuba. They were shot down by the Cubans, and the invasion was crushed later that day. Some exiles escaped to the sea, while the rest were killed or rounded up and imprisoned by Castro's forces. Almost 1,200 members of Brigade 2506 surrendered, and more than 100 were killed. The brigade prisoners remained in captivity for 20 months, as the United States negotiated a deal with Fidel Castro. Castro eventually settled on $53 million worth of baby food and medicine in exchange for the prisoners. The disaster at the Bay of Pigs had a lasting impact on the Kennedy administration. Determined to make up for the failed invasion, the administration initiated Operation Mongoose, a plan to sabotage and destabilize the Cuban government and economy, which included the possibility of assassinating Castro.